Okay, hello. Hi, merhaba, welcome. My name is Edip Asaf Bekaroğlu. Most of you from our department, so you know me. But for those from other faculties, my name is Edip Asaf Bekaroğlu. I'm a faculty member at Political Science and International Relations Department. So today we are launching a new talk series which is called Political Horizon Talks. The goal of this talk series is to open up our horizons, actually, as the name suggests, Political Horizon Talks. Open up the horizons with distinguished scholars coming here and talking, presenting different perspectives about the hot issues of our time, hot political issues of our time. So today we have Professor Irfan Ahmad. He's a long time friend of mine, right? It's been like more than 15 years. Yeah, since 2008. But he's here not because of that, of course. Irfan Ahmad is a distinguished scholar of social anthropology and political philosophy. He completed his PhD in anthropology at the University of Amsterdam and subsequently worked as a postdoctoral researcher at Leiden University, where we first met back in 2008. Later, he moved to Australia, holding various academic positions at the Australian Catholic University and Monash University. Following that, he served as Senior Research Fellow at the Max Planck Institute for Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity in Germany. Since 2022, Irfan has been in Turkey, where he is a member of the Sociology Department at İbn Haldun Üniversitesi. So Professor Ahmad is an exceptionally productive academic. His work focuses on religion and politics, modernity, critical thought, and so on. He has published extensively with some of the world's most prestigious publishers and journals, including Princeton University Press, Oxford University Press, the University of North Carolina Press, Journal of Political Ideologies, and History and Anthropology, among others. His book, Islamism and Democracy in India, was also translated into Turkish as Hindistan'da İslamcılık ve Demokrasi. His new book is also coming out soon, entitled Terrorism in Question: Decolonizing Anthropology and the Study of Islam by Berkhan Books. So beyond this impressive academic record, what I admire most about Irfan is that he is deeply critical and original thinker, actually. You can see this in his, not only in his scholarly work, but also in the opinions he shares through platforms such as Al Jazeera, The Conversation, Open Democracy, and the Middle East Eye. Today, he will critically engage with the idea of Western Enlightenment, beginning from a statement signed by Jürgen Habermas, the German philosopher and so-called living legend of critical theory. So please join me in welcoming Professor Irfan Ahmad.
Thank you, Professor Edip, for this opportunity to share my ideas here. I'm very glad to speak to this audience. This is my first talk actually at Istanbul University. Now, to go straight away to the matter, I think to talk about Gaza, the Enlightenment, and Habermas actually entails two things. The first one is to define the world we live in. What is the kind of world we are living in? And the second, what is our role in this world, both individual as well as collective? Now, the world we live in is upside down. It is an unfair and unjust world. The Nobel Peace Prize is awarded to Venezuela's Maria Machado, who shamelessly advocates shifting Venezuela's embassy to Jerusalem and declared support to the State of Israel. The new Nobel laureate calls for foreign intervention, appealing to Netanyahu, the architect of Gaza's genocide, to liberate Venezuela. Indeed, Machado spoke at a conference of European fascists, which included people like Geert Wilders and Marine Le Pen, which openly called for a new reconquista, which means ethnic cleansing carried by the Christians in 15th century Spain. However, to the Nobel Peace Committee, Machado is a champion of peace and democracy. Our world is indeed dark, in which autumn is called a spring and the oppressed are defined as aggressor. If anyone deserved Nobel Peace Prize, it is the innocent children of Gaza, both the dead and the living. If anyone deserved Nobel Peace Prize, it is over 200 brave Palestinian journalists who, while showing truth to the world, were killed by those who pretend to speak in the name of democracy, peace, and justice. Clearly, the world we live in is extremely dark. Lies are presented as truth and right as wrong. Rather than punish the perpetrators of genocide, its victims are asked to negotiate for peace. The starvation of Palestinians is described as development, and warmongers like Tony Blair is named as future governor of peace. In this dark and unjust world, saying truth is risky and dangerous. When I described October 7th as an uprising like the one enacted by Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto and critiqued the position of Habermas on this topic as highly ethnic, I was described as anti-Semitic. Nicole Dittelhoff, co-signatory to the statement issued by Habermas, tweeted my essay describing it as having a clear taste of anti-Semitism. Dittelhoff is a professor of international relations and director of Peace Research Institute in Frankfurt, Germany. Over 30,000 people had seen her tweet. On the community platform of American Anthropological Association, Michael Rabbi Sirkin termed another essay which I had composed on Gaza as repulsive and anti-Semitic. As you know, many academics and people of conscience who have opposed genocide have been targeted and fired in Europe and America, all under the bogey of anti-Semitism. So saying truth has always been costly. One has to pay the price. And Imam Malik ibn Anas did many centuries ago. I will come to that later on. With this initial proposition of, or rather the definition of the world that we live in and what our role ought to be, now I proceed to lay out the argument that I want to make. So you see, the title has the end of the Enlightenment. So I'm using end in two senses. End as something which is finished or over, but end also means something which is a goal or objective. And taking here Habermas as a defender of Enlightenment, reason, and his position on Gaza, I argue that the ongoing genocide of Palestinians means the end of Enlightenment in its both senses. From Immanuel Kant through Hegel, all the way to Habermas himself, Enlightenment has been primarily ethnic, and its so-called universalism is mainly to all but not from all. And since it is only to all but not from all, it is doomed to be missionary and Islamophobic too, and I will demonstrate how. But that is the diagnosis of the situation. What is the way out? And the way out is this, that the Gaza genocide offers both the conceptual and experiential ground to formulate a new universalism, which is not simply to all, but also from all, and it is justice pursuing. So rather than mere empty talk or passing of resolution, it has to really enact justice rather than simply talk about justice. So these are two fundamental theses that I want to present to you. And in the sense that what is the objective of the Enlightenment as I read it, and end in the sense of being finished or over, precisely because it has been ethnic. And it is not that it has happened for the first time, but Gaza offers a lens, it unveils that ethnic idea of enlightenment in its all ugly face. And that is very crucial. People have noticed it before as well, but this has brought into this has brought into enough details. It is also a genocide which is on the screen. It is a genocide which people have seen through various films and reels on Instagram and so on and so forth. Now, to make this argument, the way I approach is this, that of course in a short talk it is not possible to talk about the Enlightenment in its entirety. So I take Habermas in contemporary times as a prominent figure who represents the Enlightenment. Okay? Now you may ask, who is Habermas? So according to the Spanish newspaper called El País, he is the most famous living philosopher in the world and Europe's greatest intellectual. As you know, he is known for a phrase which is called the unfinished project of modernity. Okay? But very few people know that actually the past of Habermas is quite dark. He joined as a teenager the Hitler's youth group. He was not adult yet. He was born in 1929, and as you know, World War finished in 1945. But as a teenager, he was part of Hitler's youth group, and there is nothing in his writing, although he has referred to this episode in his life, in many interviews and also in other writings, but there is nothing substantial in his writings to show that he ever felt any guilt or shame for his adolescent role in fighting for the cause of Hitler and Nazi ideology. Now, Habermas's career began at Frankfurt School of what is called critical theory. As you know, the school was established in 1923, and it was in response to 1917 Russian Revolution. Okay, so within 5-6 years, this institute was established. Now, of course, Habermas joined it much later. Now, one major book which was published by Adorno and Horkheimer, who were the leading figures, and you know, you have a divide of first generation, second generation, and now there is also a third generation of Frankfurt School of Theorists. So Adorno and Horkheimer would belong to this first generation, and they wrote a book which is called The Dialectic of Enlightenment. It was published not in Germany but in Holland when the war was still on. And the book is very dense, but one of their, both Adorno and Horkheimer, they were quite critical of the whole project of modernity, describing Enlightenment as a mass deception. And they also described Enlightenment as a myth. Okay? Now, Habermas, post-World War II, had a serious disagreement with this conceptualization or this reading of Enlightenment, and his project became, unlike Horkheimer and Adorno in the dialectic of Enlightenment, to defend Enlightenment. But when he speaks about defending Enlightenment, he also means defending Christianity. So after World War II, in many interviews, he attacked Heidegger, saying that Heidegger had opened support for Nazi ideology, of course not talking about his own past. But one of the things which he said about Heidegger was this, that Heidegger was both anti-Enlightenment and anti-Christian. Okay, so here you have a synonymy between Enlightenment and Christianity. Although it is not entirely true that Heidegger was openly anti-Christian. Well, he was critical of his Catholic roots, but as his life changed in many ways, in later part of his life, as it is said, he returned to his roots. Okay? So it is not, his depiction of Heidegger as anti-Christian is not also accurate. So this is the larger picture of Frankfurt School and how this Frankfurt School began, especially in relation to Enlightenment and the critique that Habermas made of Adorno and Horkheimer. Now, in Habermas's own self-view, he describes his contribution to three core ideas, or all of his writings in his self-claim can be grouped under three themes, namely public space, discourse, and reason. And reason is very important because, as you know, the whole project of modernity is grounded in a claim to see reason as the ultimate determinator of everything, whether it is in terms of thinking, action, and what we have. So, insofar as this is his self-claim, but I would suggest that these three themes, which in his self-claim are his main contribution, actually it can be properly comprehended only in relation to post-World War II European and global politics, in which the key idea of German, or the key aim of the German intellectuals, including Habermas, is to reposition Germany and make it as an acceptable member of the world community, but not simply that, but also make Germany stronger. So in other words, his project is, of course, intellectual and philosophical, but it is at the same time deeply political and oriented to the interest of the state. And I will show shortly that whether it is Immanuel Kant or Hegel or Habermas, you cannot think of their thinking is basically state-centered. Okay? Now, to get further peep into his ideas, he says that what is at the core of his thinking is a conception of Occidental rationalism. So it is not simply rationality or rationalism, but it is Occidental rationalism. Logically, it implies that there is something called Oriental rationalism, although many Enlightenment thinkers thought that Orient hardly had any rational thinking or logical thinking. Okay? So it is not the defense of rationalism, qua rationalism, but it is the defense of rationalism which is Occidental, meaning Western or European, right? And this itself is very problematic. Okay? You know, the Islamic conception of reason is that reason is what distinguishes human beings from other species of God. So it is not something which is unique to one set of humanity and other set of humanity is deprived of it. You know? So before I get to his statement on Gaza, because I want to draw a general picture of Habermas's philosophy. So two works of Habermas are relevant to what I'm talking about. One is the philosophical discourse of modernity. Okay, it is a series of lectures which he gave, and then it was published as a book. Now, in this book, of course, these are not the only three figures that he discusses, but these are the figures who work as source of conceptual inspiration. Okay, the first one is Immanuel Kant, and then Hegel and Weber. Now, this is very interesting because what is the project of Immanuel Kant? So those of you who might know that I wrote a book which is called Religion as Critique, Islamic Critical Thinking from Makkah to the Marketplace. And this work does a diagnosis of both the French Enlightenment as well as the German Enlightenment. Because, you know, Immanuel Kant is so crucial in the history of Western philosophy that the entire history of Western philosophy is divided into pre-Kant and post-Kant. Okay, and I was interested that what is this enlightenment which is associated with Immanuel Kant, and what is the content and worth of that enlightenment. So if you read Immanuel Kant seriously, he is also, as you know, for him, enlightenment was to use one's own reason rather than rely on someone else's reason. But in the European context, what was that someone else? It is the church. Okay? But Islam has no church. Okay? So, but I was also interested, what is the opposite of reason that Immanuel Kant is referring to? Because to have a conception of what is actually reason, we should know what is the opposite of reason. So Immanuel Kant would refer to the opposite of reason not in one phrase or word. There are so many. At times it is superstition. At times it is zeal. Okay? At times it is psychological state of humans like delirium. Okay? A psychic condition. So these are the opposite of reason in Immanuel Kant, and all these features Immanuel Kant assigned to Islam and the figure of Prophet Muhammad. For him, Prophet Muhammad was a zealot. So zeal is something which is opposite of reason. He was also against, one of the major things that he found in his view problematic was he didn't like nomads. And much of the Muslim society has been nomadic. Okay? And the reason is, it is precisely, and as you know, Immanuel Kant never left his birthplace. Okay? The guy who talks about the world philosophy and enlightenment, he never left his birthplace, and that birthplace is not in Germany as of now. It is in, where?
Russia.
Yeah. Okay? So, this the reason he was against nomads was because he thought that thinking and a rational thinking requires a solid ground. You cannot begin to philosophize without assuming a solid ground. A marshy land cannot be the basis for philosophizing. And nomads are constantly on the move. It doesn't give you a solid base. And therefore, and if you take philosophy not as a noun, but to philosophize as an activity or as a verb, so to philosophize is to build a house. And house has to have a solid ground which is sedentary rather than nomadic. Okay? So Kant is, as it is very well known, he was steeped in racism to the extent that he said that women in Burma, which is now Myanmar, they felt proud of the fact that Europeans have impregnated them. He didn't think that people who are non-white have sufficient capacity to think. Okay, and as I showed to you, he was also hostile to Islam. The same goes for Hegel. Hegel not only legitimized colonialism in the Americas, including the enslaving of Africans and of course the brutal rule of the British colonial rule. And this entire thinking of Hegel is based in a racist conception of human beings. Okay? Now about Weber, this is interesting because Weber is taught in sociology, in political science, in international relations and other disciplines as well. And he's considered as one of not simply but also one of the fathers. I'm not sure if this is the case in political science, but in sociology, if you talk about the trinity of theorists, it is Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, right? But who is Max Weber? As you know, in Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism, he is constantly concerned about something which is unique to the West. And the term that Occidental rationalism is equally there in Weber. And Habermas actually borrows from there. But recent writings show that actually he was a sociologist of empire. And as you know, he has also written about the Ottoman Empire, his typology of different kind of authority as well as action. Now he created actually a distinct typology of sultanic despotism, and which is based on the Ottoman case studies. So this is also highly Orientalist, okay? In short, what you have in the philosophical discourse of modernity, it is a defense of Enlightenment and modernity through these three famous thinkers, Hegel, Marx, and Hegel, Kant, and Weber. But their ideas are deeply problematic. Okay. Now, the work which he is known for is also a multi-volume book called Theory of Communicative Action. Unlike philosophical discourse of modernity, theory of communicative action is more precise. It has a distinct problem, and the problem is this, that he thinks that post-World War II European social order is facing a crisis. Okay? People, especially the younger generation, didn't have any more faith in Occidental rationalism. And his task thus becomes to defend or to rehabilitate that rationality. And the way he formulates is this. He talks about what he calls internal colonization of the life world by the system. So the life world for Habermas is a zone of human life in which you have true, authentic, genuine communication. And system comprises the administrative apparatus of the state and market. Sometimes he also uses money. Okay? So this system has colonized the life world of people, and therefore you do not have any authentic communication, or all communication has been reduced to a strategic or instrumental. Okay? But now this is a very interesting thing. A thinker who calls himself critical thinker, he only talks about internal colonization of life world by system in Western plutocracies, and you will not find any substantial treatment of colonialism or imperialism in the entire writing of Habermas. And any thinker today who begins to think or theorize without a historical view of colonialism and imperialism, I would say, to say the least, is a suspect. Okay? And I also want to say that for me, colonialism is not something which happened yesterday or day before yesterday. Colonialism is something which is present in our very midst. Okay, because colonialism is not simply physical occupation of a land, it is also epistemic and intellectual. But even in the physical sense, what else is Israel but a settler colonial state? And this condition of Palestinian is one of occupation. So it is not a question of colonialism which happened in the past, it is also defining our own present, the kind of knowledge that we have, you know, the institutional structure. And nation state is nothing else but the political arm of colonial modernity. For vast majority of the non-Western world, colonialism and modernity, they are more or less the same thing, right? So colonialism as an institutional intellectual apparatus is not something which is happened long time ago. It is equally a matter of our own present. Okay. Now with this, I want to play a short 8 minutes video in which I want to relocate Habermas, not on his own terms, but the way I see it. And the reason I'm playing this this video is because I can say more or less the same thing, but it will probably take more time. But the video was long and it was edited, so for the sake of time, I will just play this one. Now let me see how I can play this. Okay. It was not out of self-love that I showed it. As you could see, I don't like watching myself. But the point I wanted to make is a series of connections, you know, human rights, the question of democracy, the Hamas and terrorism and so on. Now let's get back to the statement that Habermas made. It is a very short statement, and if one were to break it into different components, the first thing is that it expresses solidarity with Israel and Jews in Germany. The second thing is that he calls the action taken by Hamas as massacre, which aimed at eliminating Jewish life in general, and therefore the retaliation by Israel was justified as a way of war, the purpose of which is to achieve peace. And those who saw genocidal intent in Israeli action, according to Habermas, they are in error. And the final point which I quoted, he thinks that the democratic ethos of Germany is dependent upon Jewish life and Israel's right to exist, which are worthy of a special protection in the light of the mass crime of the Nazi era. The commitment to this is fundamental to our political life, and this our is Germans, intertwined with the Jewish. Now, I want to ask the following question, because you remember his philosophy is grounded in Occidental rationalism, as is the Enlightenment itself. So I want to ask, what reason is at work when Habermas expresses or extends solidarity only to Israel but not to Palestinians? There must be a conception of reason at work. And how he knows that Hamas aimed to eliminate Jewish life in general? Because in any debate, you would, if Habermas had any reasonable thinking, he should also see how Hamas itself described the action. And Hamas's own explanation is that, look, it was an attack against occupation and colonialism which started 105 years ago, which includes 30 years of British colonialism and 75 years of Zionist occupation. In Habermas's statement, it is very seductively presentist. There is no mention of history. There is no Balfour Declaration. Everything begins on October 7th. Okay? The fourth point, if Germany's democratic ethos is dependent on Israel's right to exist, then I would suggest that, is it not a recipe for supporting dictatorship and murdering human rights? Why I say this? If German democratic ethos is predicated on Israel's right to exist, then these are just some examples that what the Israeli state has done in the past. It has supported worst kind of dictatorship, including the support to South African apartheid regime, to dictatorship in Indonesia, to dictators like Ceausescu, who was also anti-Semite, but importantly also to the dictator of Paraguay, who actually shielded and gave refuge to Nazi war criminals. And why it did? Because it had a secret deal that 60,000 Palestinians would be, quote unquote, transferred to Paraguay. It did not happen. Okay? So if you have a state whose track record is support for this kind of worst or one of the worst regimes in history, then what is that democratic ethos which is dependent upon such regimes which have track record of violating human rights and supporting dictatorship? The argument logically falls apart. Okay? Now to conclude, and I can see that Edip is looking towards me. I want to conclude by emphasizing, so you remember in the beginning I said that we cannot begin to talk about the Enlightenment and Habermas and Gaza without having a definition of what is the world we live in and our role, okay? Both individual and collective. So I want to compare here because, you know, Habermas is also known as, he's not an ivory tower philosopher who simply sits in his office and writes one book after another. He has constantly intervened in public debate. Okay, so his role is one of public philosopher or public intellectual. So what kind of public intellectual Habermas is? Okay, now, you know, Foucault famously made a distinction between different types of authors. So his first category is transdiscursive. Okay, transdiscursive are those authors, and by the way, I'm taking author as intellectual or in the Islamic tradition as alim or ulama, okay, or public figures. So transdiscursive are those, and he gives the example of church fathers and Aristotle. It is very interesting. Foucault simply mentions it, but he never elaborates it. But he does focus a great deal on two other types of authors, namely discursive and the docile. Discursive authors are those who lay the foundation of a new discourse. They provide a proper lens to look at the world, how to understand it. And in this category, he puts Karl Marx and Sigmund Freud because they offered a new lens of understanding what human society is, what is the future, and so on and so forth. Docile authors are majority of the authors who simply follow the trends or the tenets set by the discursive authors. In this case, Freud and Karl Marx. Now, while Halak, who wrote a book called Restating Orientalism, published in 2018, he engages with Foucault and he expands this category or typology of author. And he adds two, dissenting author and subversive author. Dissenting authors are those who work within a set parameter, okay? They have some complaints. They identify certain aspectual problems but not foundational problems. So since they identify cracks or certain problems which doesn't allow that system to work, so their role is basically to work as a correction. Okay, if you want to use a metaphor from a mechanic like for example, what is it called? If you have a problem in your bike, you take it to a mechanic, right? Who fixes it, who repairs it. Okay? So dissenting authors are those whose job is to repair and correct the system, but never interrogate the foundation of the system. And he puts Edward Said in the category of dissenting author. Since they work as a corrector or repair of the system, such authors or thinkers are showered with prizes and awards, one after another. His final category is subversive author, although I personally do not like this term subversive. I would have preferred to use the word called transformative rather than subversive. Subversive authors are those who question the very foundation on which a particular discourse rests and also offers a new way of looking at it. And he takes the French thinker René Guénon as an example of subversive author. Now, this is the list of, you cannot see it, but this is the list of all the prizes and awards that Habermas has got from 1974 until 2024, including ZAD Award, which was quite a substantial, probably 200,000 euro. But at the 11th hour, he turned it down. Zayed is the ruler of UAE. Okay? Now, this is the classification of authors. So, what I'm saying that those who have spoken in favor of Palestinians, those who have denounced the genocide, they have been targeted, you know, fired, censored. Okay? Now, with this category, Halak's addition of dissenting and subversive to Foucault's transdiscursive, discursive, and docile, I want to conclude with an Islamic conception of ulama or intellectuals. So, in Islamic tradition, you have two kinds of ulama, ulama su or ulama haq, scholars of truth and scholars of untruth. Okay? And Imam Malik ibn Anas is, in my reading, a shining example of what an alim of truth or haq means. So you remember when Khalifa Mansur, he's the Khalif, or sorry, he's the Khalifa or Caliph, and Imam Malik had the courage to go against the Khalifa of his time and say that, look, I do not endorse your policy. And what was the policy? You know, at that time, you know, in Arabic, the term is bay, or in Turkish, you will probably say bat. So the rulers take oath from the people. And Imam Malik's position was that an oath which is forcibly taken is null and void. Okay? So the Khalifa of that time openly flogged him. Imam Malik was publicly beaten to the extent that his left arm was dislocated. Okay? And he is one of the major scholars of Medina at that time. So if he spoke truth to the power for which he has to pay the price, what we see in the case of Habermas and Gaza is that Habermas is not speaking truth, because speaking truth is speaking truth to the power. From Immanuel Kant through Hegel to Habermas, what you see, these are philosophers who worship the state power rather than critique it. And that, in a way, is negation of the critical reason which has to be used for the public good, for the advancement of human cause and humanity, rather than the sectional interest of the power elite. Power elite is the term that C. Wright Mills uses in his book called, partly in Sociological Imagination, but also a book by the same title. So what is the role of intellectuals or ulama or public figures in our time? Is not to endorse, and by the way, in the case of Germany, as you know, Habermas, and this is where I will conclude, Habermas is actually not using his reason at all. The German state has a policy which is called Staatsräson. Okay? And that policy means that German government has to work for the protection and advancement of Israeli state. So whatever the German government does, it is expected that people will also support it. Now, this is not the power of critical reason. Why doesn't Habermas use his own reason to speak in favor of truth, justice, and freedom, rather than subordinate his own thinking to the diktat of the state policy, which is called Estat raison, the reason or the interest of the state, right? And if a philosopher of our time, rather than exercise his own reason to enact justice and freedom, subordinates himself or makes himself hostage to the reason of the state, then we will not have any fairness and freedom and beauty. So to conclude, what I did, these were the 3 points that I made in this talk, that Habermas's position on Gaza unveils the ethnic character of the Enlightenment, and from the start the Enlightenment has been ethnic in its end in both the senses, and hence the genocide in Gaza and of Palestinian is also an announcement for the end of the Enlightenment. Now, this means that we do not have to sit idle, but actually it requires a new initiative, which is quite challenging, and that new initiative has to be for fashioning a new kind of universalism, not this ethnic universalism in which people like Habermas operate, but a genuinely true universalism which is not simply to all, but also from all. What I mean by this, the Western Enlightenment was based on a particular knowledge system which is quite European. It never treated the non-Western world as an intellectual category, that they have their own ways of thinking. They also have their own values. They were considered as inferior and not given any attention in the conceptualization of what the reason is or what universalism is. Because if we do work, and the work is not very easy, okay, because we know that our world is marked by diversity of thought, diversity of tradition, multiplicity of cultures. So out of this immense diversity, how to craft a universalism which is not simply handed down to everyone in a one-sided way, but it is also built upon the resources and conceptual tenets of diverse cultures. Once we do it, then we have laid down a true foundation of universalism, and that universalism, in my view, will probably be more appealing to all section of humanity rather than the existing European Enlightenment, which is primarily ethnic in its character. That is where I think I will stop. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Irfan, for this very stimulating talk. Well, now we can open the floor for question and answer section. Yeah,
thank you for your talk. You state that genocide in Gaza is an announcement for the end of the Enlightenment. So, is it different from other atrocities in the post-World War II period, like French-Algerian War, Vietnam War, American invasion of Iraq, and what Abu Ghraib, and all those? So, what happened in Gaza, the genocide in the last 2 years, is it a unique milestone in your opinion? And if so, what makes it different and special? Because in terms of hypocrisy, in terms of like the self-righteousness and like Western-centered thinking and all that, in terms of like death toll, number of people died and all that, and when you think about other examples, what makes what happened in Gaza, the genocide in Gaza, special in your view?
So, should we collect or I should respond?
Well, I think we can go one by one.
Okay. No, so if you remember, I didn't stress this. What I said that this is not, it is not that such kind of violation, or in my view, the ethnicization of human suffering has not happened before. You know, the whole point of this massacre of 500,000, I don't remember the exact figure, in Indonesia. You know, so that suffering has, what I did stress is that Gaza has unveiled all the ills, conceptual and practical, which was there in the nation-state system made after World War II. So it is not that such thing has not happened before. It has unveiled in its all details. Okay. What I would suggest, but I won't want to pursue it so ruthlessly, is also the fact that what happened in Vietnam War, I don't think, I mean, Americans know more about Vietnam War by watching films rather than reading documentary analysis in textbooks and so on. But this, I mean, of course, Baudrillard wrote about First Gulf War, that this is the first Gulf War, which was also a first war in history which was televised. Okay, but what we see in the case of Gaza is also a generational question. The young people and the Palestinians themselves, through whatever means was available. And I would say that, you know, Australia is such a far-off place, but you had a walkout in a school in a school meant only for girls, and these are teenage girls who were never shown any truth by Robert Murdoch-controlled media in Australia. But they were watching this through their Instagram feeds. And these are young people who are not even fully adult, okay? So, yeah, if you got the impression that I was saying that, you know, this is distinctly unique and nothing of this kind has happened in the past. But what I wanted to say is that the conceptual rot and the malaise which lies at the heart of this system has been fully and more thoroughly revealed through the case of Gaza genocide, and especially the international, the way it has been also internationalized, and the jury sat and passed a judgment. You know, that is also phenomenal. So this is what I wanted to say. Does that address your question?
Yeah, actually, because I was thinking about what makes you did mention the earlier period, and you say an announcement, you know. So I was thinking about what makes this, like, is it the global context, social media, maybe multi-polar world as opposed to bipolar world? That's something I've been thinking about. I mean, is it, I mean, I'm thinking, asking myself, is this going to be a turning point? What happened in Gaza? Kind of hope it will.
I think it is already a turning point. It is a turning point in the sense that the disillusionment of the world with the current system, and also in terms of thinking. Now, what remains to be seen, whether the power holders will allow such a transformation or not. But I think the conceptual, intellectual ground is ready. But as you know, major changes in world politics do not simply happen because of conceptual or intellectual reason. But clearly, I mean, you know, the word international community is simply a replacement of the term which was used before World War II, and it was called the Great Powers. And it basically meant, you know, Britain, France, and so on. And then it became international community. Now, people are raising this question that, oh, what do you mean by this international community? Just 5 or 6 countries. And even the representative of these countries who sit in the UN or elsewhere, they do not represent their own population, by the way. You know, we know in 2003, when Iraq was destroyed or invaded, you had millions of people who had taken to the streets in London, New York. So the population is not in line with what the government was doing. So this raises another question, which is about what do we mean by democracy? So in this case, actually the leaders, rather than representing the views of the people, you know, and people is, by the way, a very slippery concept, especially when it has been hijacked by populists. So rather than represent the views and aspiration of the people, the state or the power elites, they were violating the aspiration and views of the people.
Can I ask you a question?
Yeah. First, I will Lisa.
Okay.
Thank you for your speech, very rising opinion. You have talked about universality in my opinion, and it is to all and not from all. When we talk about universality, United Nations comes to my mind as an institution established to bring peace and security for all, as stated in the UN Charter as well. So I would like to ask, what do you think about the universality of the United Nations? Do you think it is from all to all, or does it share the ethnic character of the United Nations?
Jacques Derrida has a chapter in his book called The Spectre of Marx, which deals with United Nations, and he calls it as a monster. I don't understand what kind of democracy is this in which you have 5 members who have the veto rights. This is anything but expression of democracy in the true sense of the term. Now, what is the name of the British Prime Minister? Starmer, right? Starmer and Macron, now they have recognized Palestine now. But more than 150 nation states had already recognized it before. So in any case, it is too late and too little, right? So you have so many resolutions which have been passed in favor of Palestine, but no action has been taken by the United Nations. There are a series of. So if it is universal, and that is where the question is, the question of universal is not that you have an organization like this room where you have representative from each country, and that country is based nation state. It has to be, if it has to be universal, it has to be universal in terms of the drawing upon the resources of values, and at the same time also applying those values to every situation. So just a statistical representation of different nation state in a body like the United Nations is far from universal. One is not talking about numerical or a statistical representation. One is talking about conceptual ethos representation in terms of justice, fairness, and equality, not simply a statistical. So in that sense, no, United Nations is far from this idea. Does that address your?
I have a question that's kind of in line with the Can I go ahead? Because this will dive into the right part.
You can.
Yeah, thank you.
So just to add on to that, like now we talk about this universalism, but how is it going to enjoy the currency in the current world where the West is at the helm of affairs? That's to say, doesn't it necessitate the dismantling of those forces which are basically which are not allowing this universalism to unfold? So doesn't it necessitate the dismantling of those forces? Like, what is the way forward? How is this going to take concrete shape?
Yeah, I mean, I wish I could give you a blueprint, okay? But I think, you see, one of the major things is that no philosopher worth his or her name had ever predicted the fall of Berlin Wall or of the Soviet Union. So you do have a set of philosophers or scholars who engage themselves in the business of prediction. I think that is a very risky thing. And I'm not one of those who will predict, but what I can say in response to your question is that we do not know what the shape of the future would be, but we have to work towards it. And the fundamental position to begin that work would be basically to recognize that there is a fundamental problem and we need to overcome it. And it seems to me that in many quarters, I mean, of course, there are people who do recognize this challenge, right? But there are people who think, this was an interview given by, I think, the former Dutch Prime Minister. And he says that, well, there are some strains in the current system. He's not ready for any change, or definitely not for fundamental change. Okay? So it is more like the correction or the repair. What you are proposing is not repair, but a fundamental reshaping of the... So once we begin to recognize that actually there is a problem, right, that would be the first stepping stone towards evolving a better alternative. Now, as a thinker or as a student of politics or as a human being, I think from an Islamic perspective, our effort should be that, okay, we put our efforts, we do not even know what the outcome would be. But at least recognition of this and internalization of a task that, no, we have to begin to work towards it. That would be the first stepping stone. And people like yourself who belong to the generation, which generation is this? Generation Z or something, right? So, or what is the other one is millennial or something. So all these generation which will play a key role in shaping the future. I mean, we, the older generation will also have our role, but this is people like yourself who have to take up this challenging task and execute it in the future.
Yeah, fine.
Yeah. Thank you for being here, Professor. My question is, you have mentioned that earlier that the genocide in Gaza is a turning point for humanity, and you said that the end of Western Enlightenment.
Yeah.
One of my professors has said to me that the October 7th could be the French Revolution of the 21st century. What is your opinion on that? Thank you.
I mean, I would like to know what were the assumptions based on which the professor said this. And I do not have access to those assumptions, so it would be very hard for me to speculate. Okay?
Yeah, but the French Revolution has impacted broadly in a couple of centuries. Maybe the October 7th could be the same or maybe similar impact on 21st century's politics, you know?
Yeah, so this is also in the realm of what will happen in the future, but all I can say, this is a very famous saying which is attributed to many figures, including Chairman Mao. You know, the Chinese leader. He was asked that, what do you think is the impact, or what has French Revolution done? You know? And you know what he said? He said that it is too early to say. Okay? Now, in relation to October 7th, you know, Lukács, he would say that we should always have this we should have the capacity to look at the present always as a matter of the past. And I think October 7th, do we consider it as a matter of the past, or it is still a matter of the present? You know? Now, let me tell you this. I'm not sure if my publisher will like it, but I think I should still say this. So I have a new book which is coming, and I put, you know, every book has a conclusion. And I titled that conclusion as anti-conclusion. And this is about war on terror. And I said that how can you conclude about a phenomenon which is still ongoing, right? So they said that, well, anti-conclusion doesn't look very proper. So we agreed the latest round of discussion is that now it will be titled as conclusion/non-conclusion, not anti-conclusion, right? So anyway, my point is to think, I mean, I would like to know from your professor what were the assumptions based on which he said this and what he meant it. But if you take French Revolution as a necessarily only positive thing, that is not the whole of the history. Or to look at the world through the prism of repercussion or the degree to which other parts of the world were impacted by French Revolution is also a very, to state the obvious, Eurocentric way of looking at the world. I'm not saying that, you know, this was not an important event. It was, right? But in many accounts, it becomes like, okay, the defining moment of modern world, or one of the defining moments of the modern world. Now, there are recent writings about French Revolution and which questions the fundamentals of the ways in which this event has been narrated in much of the history. So I think you should have a discussion with your professor and ask him about the assumption, and then probably we can have a cup of chai and then see. Sure.
Thank you. Maybe last question. When I saw your flyer like a couple of days ago on one of WhatsApp groups, I made a quick comment actually that, you know, you can be a thinker for 50 years, you know, you can write, you can be esteemed by many, and then at a critical crossroad, you take a wrong stance, and everything you wrote, you thought, will go to garbage, at least will be shadowed heavily.
Right.
For good. That was my comment actually. After your presentation, I saw that this comment of mine is too simplistic, too innocent against it actually. But I understand from your conclusion at least that this is not a single incident of wrong stance at a crossroad being the Gaza situation. But it is a continuation of the Western, let's say, post-Kant thinking on the Orient. This is just only one reflection, perhaps, of the deep-rooted thinking and perhaps the stances, lifelong stances of Habermas and others. What would you say on that? I mean, it's only one wrong instance of, saying something wrong, let's say, in front of humanity, or is it something that this person had for his, life against the Orient, let's say?
Yeah, so you do have people who have interpreted Habermas's statement as something like a digression, okay? Or something which is not actually fundamental to his thinking, but something which was a minor kind of mistake, okay, or error. I do not necessarily see this. I mean, this is Edip Asaf's namesake called Asif Beth, and this is what he thinks, that, Habermas was, you were so great. Asif Beth met him when Habermas, I don't remember, he met him probably outside of Europe, and they had a discussion, and it was all about Iran and so on and so forth. So he's quite mesmerized by Habermas, and then the narration is that, you are such a powerful, great thinker, and we got disappointed by your statement. Okay? No, I think, this is clearly one way of looking at it, right?
How about your own opinion? What do you think?
No, but I think this has to be also, I think it is not simply, what is project of Habermas. I mean, he himself has says that, look, I mean, this is the guy, if you read the essay based on which I made this talk, when he was not compromised, he clearly said that capitalism and democracy, they cannot go together. Okay? So this is, we have to also see that, you know, this philosopher has a long life and he has written extensively. So at one point of time, he did say that. But after the fall of communism, the guy has come to the conclusion that, look, there is no alternative to capitalism, and the only thing which you can do is to tame the ills of capitalism, to tone it down, to temper it, right? So from a Marxist perspective, no, capitalism is the source of problem. So if, and as you know, he although in one writing, he said that he's the last Marxist, describing himself as the last Marxist. But if you see, there are German scholars who themselves have shown that how his engagement through European Union and so on and so forth, no, it is not presenting a better alternative. So if we take capitalism, if the goal of a philosopher is to tame capitalism or to reform it, okay, then I think capitalism is not simply an economic system as we know. You know, my friend Gil Anidjar, he wrote a book which is called Blood, a critique of Christianity, in which he is saying that capitalism is also Christianity in a very philosophical sense, which you, if you read Weber, you will get some hints of that. So if capitalism is what has defined our contemporary world, and if you think, unless that, okay, this is the best world, and let me say this, that there are all kinds of people in the world, but for the purpose of our discussion today, we can say that there are mainly two kinds of people. There are those who say that, look, this world is beautiful. And there are those who say that I wish the world was beautiful. Okay? So my thinking is aspirational to the second group. For Habermas, everything good has already happened. The Enlightenment has already happened. You know, the public sphere which he glowingly writes about in Europe, all the good things have already happened, right? And there is no engagement. What kind of philosopher you are who do not know anything about, I mean, I'm probably putting it in a more exaggerated way, but who do not, what kind of philosopher you are who doesn't know about things, tradition, culture, philosophy outside of Germany, right? And have the audacity to claim that what you are saying is universal. This almost borders on sheer arrogance, nothing else. By which I do not mean that, this is not to discard, by the way, the fact that, you know, European way of thinking, it is one among many ways in which humans have thought about what life ought to be, what kind of society we have to make. To say that this is the only way, okay, is nothing else but deeply ethnocentric, and by virtue of that, it is also oriented towards violence. I think any conception of the world has to be grounded in a plural conception of our ontology. And our task is not as, and this is a sad part of the non-Western world, where many thinkers think that, okay, our task is to apply the concepts and theory which has been supplied by the West. Okay? No, our task is to equally fashion, create our own concept. Because unless we create our own concept, unless we create our own vocabulary, we cannot have alternative thinking. Right? And Habermas, I mean, this is although he himself would say in many places that whatever he says is deeply or characteristically German, right? But any claim for universalism has to have some idea about what people in the non-Western think, what are their intellectual resources, vocabulary. And I would say language is very important. I consider a person who simply speaks one language as a poor person. You know what I mean by poor person here? You may be a millionaire, but intellectually you are a poor person. Because thinking is ultimately expressed in language, and a rich person is one who speaks more than one language. At least 2 languages, 3 languages. You know, the more you speak, and I think, you know, by that account, historically Istanbul has been a cosmopolitan place in the sense that, you know, you have intellectuals here who were writing in Ottoman languages, Farsi, Arabic, you know, writing poetry in 3 languages at the same time. So I think that was a little bit a long response to your otherwise short question, but I hope it addresses some parts of it.
Any other questions? I have a question, Irfan.
Sure.
I actually have 2 questions. First, this new universalism concept, I mean, you left it very abstract. Could you tell us some, you know, at least some foundational premises of this concept? Second question is about the possibility of the intellectual, the desire, like truth seeker or subversive or transformative in your words. Now, we are living in an age, there are too much production, intellectual production or academic production. So many things are being written every day.
Yeah.
Also, to make the things more complicated, we are living in a post-truth, you know, post-truth age, they say. So, what is the challenge, or is it possible to have that kind of intellectual, you know, in this age?
Yeah, so these are tough questions. To the first one, so let me give you a very banal example. If I say, this is an imaginary situation, so please don't take it seriously. So I say that I will take the whole audience for dinner, okay? I wish I could take you all for dinner. But then I say that, look, I will treat you to dinner and everybody will get pizza. So this is universal to all. So I'm not making a discrimination that I'm offering pizza, but I'm not making a distinction whether you are a man or a woman, whether you are wearing hijab or you are not wearing hijab, whether you are Turkish speaking or non-Turkish speaking. So it is a universal thing which I'm giving to all, and there I'm not making any discrimination, right? So this is universalism to all. But in this universalism, there is of course a fundamental problem in the sense that I never ask you that do you like pizza or not? Or there are so many foods in this world, right? Why not kebab? Why not chorba? If I expel all these options, okay, and then insist that this universal offer of pizza to all of you is actually the only way in which we can think about universalism, then of course it is a misleading conception of universalism. Now, if you replace this, the example of pizza, okay, with what is the intellectual foundation on which people like Immanuel Kant, Hegel, or others, including Habermas, have based their universalism. It is not out of nothing that they have created this. There is some basis. What is that basis? Intellectual basis or epistemological basis? Does Habermas know what Ibn Rushd has to say something? Does Habermas know what Ibn Arabi has to say something? Does Habermas know what Muhammad Iqbal has to say something? This is just one example, but you might say that in Africa there is no philosophy, and parts of Africa is, by the way, very oral culture. You do not have written books. But I would say, actually, there was one anthropologist who wrote a book which is called The Primitive Philosopher. And this is about the Aboriginals in America. So philosophy is not simply something which is inscribed in text and produced in Europe. People, if to philosophize is to think about who we are, how to shape our future, what kind of human beings we want to be, Europe and European thinkers have thought about it, but other parts of the world have also thought about this. Do you see my point? So this pizza thing, it is just like if I'm offering pizza, I'm just telling you that, look, you don't need to read any philosophy or intellectual resources from Africa, from China, from the Muslim world, or from the Hindu tradition. Just read European philosophy and so on and so forth. So in that sense, a new universalism, it cannot be just to all, like pizza. It will require knowledge of different cultural tradition, different conception of what a good polity is. Okay? I mean, of course, the Greek philosophers have thought about what an ideal polity is, but so has Farabi. And of course, Farabi was influenced by Greek philosophy, right? But to say that, it is simply a carbon copy is also not correct, right? There have been conception of what an ideal ruler is in other tradition. So this from all would mean mobilizing resources, understanding the conception of the world and the human beings. And now, of course, we should not be simply talking about anthropocentric world, which means only human beings, but also about ecology and so on and so forth, right? So once we have conceptual resources, like rather than simply saying that pizza is universal to all, if we agree on what is the content that we are offering to the world, and that agreement about the content or about the dinner has to be from all sources. Now, this is easier said than done, right? But it is just an idea about which people have to think, because if you do not think along this line, it will be only, what I mean by missionary is, missionary is, of course, the conversion to Christianity. But missionary also has a secular meaning, okay, in the sense that we want to convert you, okay, to a secular worldview. That is also a missionary project, okay? Or people are not rational beings, because in any case, people in the pre-capitalist world, pre-capitalism world, there is something called moral economy. And that moral economy is not based on the same logic as the capitalist economy, because in ordinary formulation of capitalism, maximization of self-interest and minimization of harm. No, the world is not simply comprised in terms of zero-sum game. There are also moral economy in which maximization of interest may not be necessarily the key foundation. Okay? So, of course, this is easier said than done, but I think once we begin to see problem from this perspective, then again, back to the question at the back, that we do not know if ever it will, I mean, let me say the final point about it, the Europeans themselves also know that what they are calling universal is not universal. I don't think there is a universal. There are attempts to universalize things. Okay, and these attempts are not simply persuasive, these attempts are also, by the way, very coercive. Because, you know, if we simply look at the world, I mean, this used to be my question when I was teaching in Australia. I mean, if you walk in the streets, you have Vietnamese restaurants, you have Afghani restaurant, you know, you have Indian restaurant, you have Turkish restaurant, but political parties are only two, liberals and labours. So if there is so much of diversity in food, in culture, why the political question is reduced to only two? In America, it is Republican versus Democrat. And in Britain, it is Tory versus whatever. What is the other party? Right?
Better than one party.
Better than one party, that is correct. But this two-party system doesn't, by no means, it represents the sheer diversity which comprises our life. Okay? By the way, I think this is something which is attributed to Chomsky. Somebody asked him that, you know, we should think about forming a third party in America. And he says that, no, actually we need to form a second party. Right? Because what is presented as two different parties, they are more or less the same. One. Now to your second question, which is about the role of intellectual and public figures
in today's challenges.
And also you raise a very important question about the knowledge, right? So I think, I mean, people have spoken about fragmentation of knowledge. Okay? Now that is very depressing. So I'm somebody who doesn't like disciplinary knowledge. I describe myself as, so one response to disciplinary knowledge is to say that you are interdisciplinary, right? And many people say that, you know, this is an interdisciplinary department and so on and so forth. I think that is one response. I prefer to be pre-disciplinary. What I mean, pre-disciplinary is that all these departments of political science, anthropology, sociology, these are all developments which happened in late 19th century. Okay? And if you want to use the word departmentalized knowledge, but knowledge existed before the creation of these departments, right? So for me, a better term is pre-disciplinary knowledge rather than interdisciplinary or multidisciplinary knowledge. I think Immanuel Wallerstein, he is also against this disciplinary knowledge, but the term he uses is called historical social science. Okay? Now, I think the crisis that you are referring to in my reading is a very big crisis in the sense that our knowledge is also, and forget about an anthropologist reading things from the writings of psychologists and so on and so forth. Within anthropology, the discipline that I know better than other, you have medical anthropology, you have urban anthropology, you have gender anthropology. Medical practitioner of medical anthropology, they do not know what is happening in other subfield. You know, so Eric, what was his name? I'm forgetting his name, the Pathways of the World, a famous anthropologist, Eric Wolf. He wrote an article and he says that they divide and subdivide and call it anthropology. So there is fragmentation within the discipline, and then of course, now the kind of intellectuals and scholars that we have, we only speak about parts. Okay? So if the whole and every day there is a specialization and sub-specialization, right? And this is increasingly becoming even more dense. Now, I think, I don't think I can answer your question in full, but in the interest of time, all I can say is that if you take the medical analogy of human organism, right? So, of course, we do have eye specialist, heart specialist, orthopedics and so on and so forth. But a better doctor who simply knows about heart, but who is not at least fundamentally familiar with the mechanism of the whole body, right? Then the treatment offered by that specialist would be problematic. And that is one reason I think when people have serious kind of disease, then there is a physician who gets reports from all the specialists and then make a judgment about your whole body. And if you want to use the term holistic treatment or holistic conception of medicine, I think we do not, in social science and humanities, it is very hard to do it given the immense diversification of knowledge that we have. And I think sometimes I wonder whether we are becoming actually ulama or a scholar, or what C. Wright Mills used to use this term, which I find quite not an alim or a scholar, but a technician. Okay, and it looks like the way our world is changing, including academia and especially the neoliberal kind of quantification of knowledge, right? Where what you argue in the article becomes less important than the fact that how many articles you have published. And then the classification of those articles as Q1, Q2, and Q3. So this is simply to put in a more or less appropriate language. Well, no, I think it is appropriate. It is used in English. It is bastardization of knowledge, where knowledge is turned into statistics, right? Now, this was, I think, one part of your question, but Adib, what was the other part of your question? About
too much production, and I mean, what would be the impact of intellectual in this flow? But we can discuss later if you like, because we are kind of out of time.
Okay.
But you mostly answered my question. Thank you. Thank you for you all contributing, joining us today. We will have continuation of this talk series next week on Wednesday, same time. We are having another talk.
Same please. No. Same please.
Not in this class, but I will make the announcement.